Hello, welcome to Adventures in Angular, the podcast where we keep you updated on all things Angular related. This show is produced by two companies, Top End Devs and Envoyed. Top End Devs, where we create top end devs who get top end pay and recognition while working on interesting problems and making meaningful community contributions. And Envoyed, which provides remote design and software development services on a task basis, so clients only pay when tasks are delivered and approved. In today's episode, we will talk about the Angular CLI and all the new features around it from the latest versions and also what is coming next. And I can say that we know what's coming next because my name is Lucas Paganini. I'm your host in the podcast. But joining me in today's episode is Alan Agius, which is working from Google in the Angular core team and focused on developing the Angular CLI. So, welcome, Alan.
Thank you for having me here. It's a true pleasure.
Thank you for taking the time. Well, let's get onto it. So, Alan, why don't we start with the latest changes and then we can later go into what's coming in the future? So, we are currently on version 17 of Angular, at least the stable released version of Angular is the 17. So, do you think there are any notable changes that maybe the Angular developers worldwide aren't taking full advantage of yet and they should be aware of?
Okay, so in version 17.3, which will actually be released as stable later on this week, we introduced an optional migration for users to upgrade their existing applications to use the application builder, which is based and uses ES-Build and Vite. This basically enables to reduce the number of commands you need to run if you use SSR or SSG, improve the reload time, like the edit refresh loop, basically, and also reduces the build times. Other than that, the application the bundles will be outputted to ESM instead of like the Webpack format. So we also modernize the output format. And yeah, other than that, in version 17.0, we also like improved the SSR and SSG experience for users. And so now when users create a new application, they can immediately choose to use server-side rendering and static-side generation. I think from the Angular CLI, those are like the main things that we introduced recently.
Nice. You mentioned that we are now outputting ES modules, and
That's
I
correct.
nice. Well, apart from the performance improvements, there is a browser compatibility concern that at least used to be a major concern. I'm happy to say that nowadays web developers have been less concerned about this as modern browsers have been more diligent in auto update features and also just keeping them updated on the latest features from ECMAScript. But I do think that something that people aren't very aware of is that Angular does have some automatic polyfills. So correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, if you have a browser list, I think that's the correct name of the file, right? So it should be
Yeah.
dot browser list rc, and you can put there all the browsers that your application is supposed to support, and then the Angular CLI will automatically add CSS prefixes and add other necessary JavaScript polyfills to make sure that your code is going to be as much supported as possible in all those browsers. Is that correct?
Well, it does add CSS prefixes and vendor prefixes for CSS. However, it does not add any JavaScript polyfills. What it does is that basically it will down level certain ES features um, to uh, their previous ECMA version. So, for example, instead of uh, if, for example, a browser doesn't support the spread operator, it will use object as a sign, etc. So it doesn't add polyfills; it just uses a different output version of ECMA. That being said, there is also a constraint, uh, which is there might be certain browsers that simply do not work because Angular doesn't support all the browsers there are, and officially Angular supports like the last two major versions of Chrome, the two major versions of Safari, and I believe also the two last major versions of Firefox. Um, so yeah, while it can work on other browsers, it is not officially supported.
Gotcha. But is that done in the Angular CLI, or is that something that is based on the target module that I set in my TS config? Because I know that TypeScript does that for me depending on the module that I'm targeting. So it just adds the necessary down level polyfills for that.
So actually the target setting in the TS config is not used because internal in the CLI it is always overridden, just
Mm,
because to honor the browsers list, because otherwise users would have to um, manually keep them in sync based on what browsers you need to support. You need to change your TS config, etc. So a couple of major versions ago, we decided that the browsers list configuration is sort of the source of truth, which based on the browsers you support, you list it there, and it will output the right JavaScript and the right CSS that is compatible with those browsers, excluding any polyfills. So if there's a polyfill, an API that doesn't exist on a certain browser, users would still need to add polyfills.
interesting. So, for example, if I want to use structured clone and I want to make sure that the browsers are supporting it, then I need to manually add a structured clone polyfill. Is that correct?
Uh, Correct. If one of your browsers doesn't support it.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. That's good to know because for a very long time I thought that the Angular CLI would also add those JavaScript polyfills too. But so now I understand that the JavaScript polyfills are based on so the Angular CLI only changes the target from TypeScript, and TypeScript itself might not polyfill but down level those things, so they would still work. And what the Angular CLI also does is to prefix the CSS properties. Interesting, interesting,
Yeah.
nice. Okay. Um, what about next steps for the Angular CLI? What is coming next?
Okay. So definitely we want to continue moving forward and invest in ES build and White. Um, Also, since Karma has been deprecated, we also recently have released Web Test Runner Builder, and I think in version 16 we released Jest Builder, and we want to continue improving them and eventually make them as stable. Uh, in version 18, definitely expect some changes and improvements around SSR and static site generation, including improvements for I18N. Uh, I think that is what coming in the next major version, primarily in the CLI.
Okay, you
And as
mentioned.
always, like continuing bug fixes and things like that.
Okay, you mentioned internationalization. So I'm not sure if this is going to be inside the scope of the Angular CLI. I thought it wouldn't, but since you mentioned, I gotta ask. One feature that I know is possible in the latest version of Angular is to dynamically load uh, translations, and this has been possible for a while now. But it's just not very well documented. But I know that it is possible. But we are still making multiple builds for each different language, right? So you still set Angular to make the like if you have 7 languages, it's still going to create 7 builds at the end. It's much faster because it does a lot of the process, the shared process before, and then it just applies the translations at the end. But it still does that in the equal amount of languages that your application supports, because the first, I wouldn't, maybe not first class. Um, what I was going to say is that the main use case for internationalization in Angular is for the developers to actually make different builds. Like, although Angular does support dynamically loading them, it's still the main use case. I think people are still making different builds and maybe loading based on the route prefix, like
Yeah.
/en /pt/es. Um, I
Yeah.
think you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, there are two ways you can localize an application with Angular. There's the build time, where you have like multiple builds, as you mentioned, or there's the runtime, which basically you have a single build and you load the translation during runtime, which can come from either being hard coded in your code or an external source like a CMS or a JSON file. Um, there are lots of advantages and disadvantages to both cases. Primarily, using build time translations, while it does slow down the build, it reduces the bundle size, and also you have slightly faster experience for the user since there's no translations happening on the fly. Um, wha- while on the other hand, runtime translations, you have a single build, and you can also like change translations on the fly, meaning that if you have translations coming from an API or CMS, you don't need to redeploy every time a translation is changed or something like that. So it's also depends on your requirements, what sort of translation is suits you best, and basically what we want to improve is the experience with both sort of translations when using SSR SSG, because from what the users tells us that there are some shortcomings, and we definitely want to improve the experience around that area mainly. But
Okay.
as you explained, definitely runtime translations are not well documented, and we are aware of that. And this is something that is definitely on our radar.
Okay. Besides, so let me see if I get this right. So there's the lack of documentation issue. Okay, we got that. But besides that, are you planning to change in any way how the runtime translations are done, or is it just an issue with documentation?
So for SSR, there will be a slight change for both sort of translations, but it should be not that visible to the user. So basically, the changes will be more of an internal changes. However, it would improve uh, how users would basically scaffold their application, meaning that they will no longer need to add extra code on top of what we generate. It will be done by default, but the I18N itself will not change.
Okay, interesting. And currently, is there a way for me to generate a build of my application that doesn't contain any applied languages at all? Like, I don't want to generate the base language one. I want to just generate one that only has the language tokens and it doesn't have any any transcriptions, even in the base language built in. It's just the language tokens, and I'm going to load them on runtime because I don't want to even spend 1 kilobyte of data downloading languages that
Mhm.
are not are maybe not going to be the ones that are going to be used. Is there a way for me to do this currently?
Uh, Not that I am aware of, no,
Okay.
because the actual source codes, source code value or original language value is sort of the key of the translation at
Hmm.
the moment. So,
Gotcha.
so what you can do is basically change that to instead of saying, I don't know, hello world, this is my application, you can change that to something shorter and make it as a key.
So the actual text is the key. That's interesting because I always
Yes,
thought that it would generate a random ID and that would be the key.
that's for the runtime translations. For the build time translations, for the runtime, it's slightly different.
Hmm.
Since there's
Interesting.
no since during the runtime there's no, the build doesn't take care of internalization, it will not amend the keys.
And how does it deal with the same key but with different translations based on the ID? Like, let's say that I have the string hello in two different
Mhm.
components, and in one component, it should translate to Portuguese to Olá, and the other should translate to Yai. So I'm translating the same hello string, and at
Mhm.
build time that would work because it would generate different IDs, but at runtime it would just map to the same to like the first instance that it finds. Is that it?
Uh, that is a good question, and on top of my head, I don't really know how it's really handled.
Okay, okay, nice. I made the first difficult question to the
You
dude that
did.
actually built this thing.
I
Awesome.
did. I did not build internalization.
Okay. Okay, but that works on it. Okay. Okay, nice, nice. Um, let me see what else we can talk about. So one thing that I generally do a lot on any
Mhm.
Angular project that I'm working on is to add NX for it. And
Okay.
there are many reasons to add NX to a code base. So if you really want a mono repo, you want to have your front end and your back end, then sure. But I feel that in a lot of cases where I added NX, I didn't really needed the back end in there. I was just adding NX because I wanted to break parts of my application into libraries and be able to easily import them,
Mhm.
import those private libraries inside my main application code, and just make it easier to isolate things. And I know that Angular already provides a solution for that. So I know that I can use the Angular CLI to generate libraries. But
Yes.
the last time that I used the Angular CLI for that, and I gotta be honest, that was like 2 years ago, maybe. So it might have changed from since then. But the last time I did that, I lost the hot reloading feature. I lost a lot of the real time debugging that I got from just having the code in my main application bundle. So I just got used to adding NX to every project so that I would have this live reloading changes and etc. I was wondering if there were any updates since then, and if not, if this is in the roadmap.
So, in the Angular CLI, we do have concepts of a library and application, and basically, in order for you to live reload the changes, you would need to build the library in watch mode and the application in watch mode, uh, using two different commands, right? And there is a reason for that, and the reason being is that um, the way NX does it is slightly different. And while you say isolate your code in library, that is actually not completely true. It's what you are doing is actually having that library be built as part of the application. So there is no isolation in theory. This can result in two main problems, right? One, a library has its own rules and its own compilation, uh, and uses a different builder, which is not exactly the same as an application builder. That means in some cases, things that work when you build your library as part of your application, they do not actually work when you build your library as a library. So if you want to ship your library, uh, you might have some challenges here if you sort of create a non-publishable library and then move it to a publishable library in Nginx. Um, However, uh, users do use this version of non publishable libraries in Nginx, and it's quite popular. Uh, it's just another way of organizing your code. But I just want to make it clear it's not isolating your code from your application. It is still part of your application. It is still built fully as part of your application. So it's like having a subdirectory under SRC application because that library code is still treated fully as application code.
I have a few questions about that before we go on, and just to make sure that everyone is understanding what we're talking about. So let me see if I get this correct. What you're saying is that when we are isolating things in a library and we're using the Angular CLI to do it, it creates its own entire build context. And when you actually build that library, you're building that in isolation. And
Correct.
for NX, this isn't true in the meaning that those libraries are just going to be placed inside the application bundle as if it were a folder inside the application. So from a developer perspective, you're getting the isolation that you want in terms of code base organization, just like isolating the files and making it easy for, like, if you want to just copy and paste an entire library into another project, you can because they are isolated in that. But in terms of the actual build, it's still a single build. So this
Correct.
is what we're talking about. Interesting.
Correct.
So in that note, I I have one question. So NX allows me to have different TS configs for each library, for each NX library. I'm going to call them NX libraries so that we already have a distinction between Angular CLI libraries and NX libraries, because as we were just discussing, they are different definitions. So I can have a different TS config for each NX library. But if they are sharing the same build process, how is that possible?
So in the next, there are also two concepts of libraries: publishable and non-publishable libraries. Uh, and it is also based on how the tsconfig paths are configured, meaning that uh, in your application tsconfig for the library, there is a path specified, which can be either the TypeScript files, meaning that the TypeScript will be of the library will be compiled and bundled as part of the application, or actually the path be pointing to an actual distributed version of the library or already built library. So it also comes down to how it is configured in your TypeScript configuration.
Gotcha. So if I were to set a particular NX library to be publishable, then it would create its own build context.
Uh, yes, but I'm not sure if it's, I don't recall if by default if it's consumed in a library, it will be built beforehand or just built as part of the library of the application. Excuse me.
Interesting. Okay. So now getting back to pure Angular without Annex,
Mhm.
is there any advisable strategy? Like I imagine that inside Google, you guys are dog feeding Angular everywhere, right? So you're using Angular in many different internal projects, and there's probably a need to isolate certain parts of your Angular applications into modules. And I mean modules just in the sense of a folder that contains all the logic related to that particular feature, so that is easy to just copy and paste and port that to other projects. How What is the current recommended approach to do this with pure Angular without Nx? Is to just place those as regular folders inside the application source?
So inside and outside Google, Angular is slightly different because how you build Angular is slightly different because internally in Google, the Angular CLI or NX is not used. We have our own build system, which is uh, Blaze, which open source is called Bazel, which basically handles everything for us, meaning that you can go as fine grained as having a build for a component, a single component, or having a build or library of a single module or a whole application. So it's quite fine grained of how you can structure the code inside Google. And in general, if you want to reshare code, it will be its own build. So it will be a sort of a TypeScript library or an ng library, and it will have its own build, which your application or your other module will be dependent on. And Bazel will uh, basically build everything and all the dependencies that are needed. So when you build your application, it will find all the dependencies that your application needs, and it will rebuild them automatically.
Interesting. So all of that in a single process.
Yes,
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned that Bazel is the open sourced version of Blaze.
yes.
Um, do you have any plans, like the Angular team has any plans to make it easier for other companies besides Google to have this fine-grained build system, or is it just not in the plans?
So actually, we did try. Uh, I think around version 8 or 10, we had an Angular Bazel um, labs where you could use the Angular CLI with Bazel. However, that was not super successful just because uh, Bazel needs quite a lot of configuration, and unless you are building a very large application, it is not beneficial because you will not see uh, that much of a build gain. I mean, if your code base is small or relatively small, Bazel does have an overhead. So instead of having a faster build, if your application is small, your application build will be quite slow. And before there were also some incompatibilities with Windows, so it's definitely not in our plans again to um, invest in making Basil a first-class citizen of Angular CLI.
Okay. But is this still possible? Like, even though it's not a first class citizen, if anyone wanted to use Bazel to run their Angular builds currently on version 17 and just going forward, is that still possible? Like, could a community driven plugin be created? Or,
Yeah, I mean, Bazel can be used to build any language. So it can be used to build Go, Java, Python, anything, any language can be built using Bazel.
Interesting. And when it's used inside Google, is
Mhm.
it, um, for example, are we talking about using Blaze just to build an Angular code base, or is it also very common to have a backend in the same repository and having the same Bazel, the same Blaze process building the front end and the back end?
So in Google, there's a single monorepo with hundreds and thousands of projects, and there is only a build system, which is, or there's one primary build system, which is Bazel, which with the same process can build an X amount of languages. Because when you do like Bazel build, it can check what dependencies your application needs. If it needs a backend, it will build your backend. It, and if that backend requires some other services, it will build them. So yeah, it can build with the same process an infinite amount number of dependencies and an infinite amount number of languages.
Interesting. Okay. That's very interesting. At least like for enterprise companies out there to know that this is an option. Although I imagine that it could be very costly to set up, uh, and maybe due to the lack of other companies using it, it might not even be worth it, depending on how much time they are saving. But at least this is an option that um, enterprise companies could consider. Interesting. Okay. Alan,
Yep.
we spoke about several things already. I know that there are many others that we could go into. I don't want to drag the episode too long, just to keep the main content concise for the audience. But I do want to open the floor for you and ask, do you think there are any other topics that we should have covered, like you think they are interesting and important enough that we should talk about them today and that perhaps we haven't yet?
Let me think a bit. Mm, I cannot think right now of anything that might be helpful to discuss. Uh, so yeah, I cannot think of anything right now that like it's worth pointing out.
Okay. In terms of some of the things that we were discussing before, we talked a bit about internationalization and runtime
Mhm.
internationalization. And we mentioned that currently there aren't any good official docs about it. But I was
Yes.
wondering if you know of any good source as a third party company that maybe wrote interesting articles about how to do runtime internationalization, just so that we can send something for the audience for those that are interested in that.
So about there is a third-party community project that leverages Angular internalization and builds on top of it. I think it's called Interloco. Let me try to find it. Angular I. um,
And this library, it leverages the runtime
yes.
functionalities, right? Not just the build time.
Yeah. It's actually for the runtime translations. I'm trying to find it. Uh, Transloco, I think it was called Transloco. Yes, I think I found it. Yeah, it was this one.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to send this in the comment section. So if you're listening to the show and there is no comment section from where you're consuming the show, you can just look for it on YouTube with the same title. So Alan Agius, Angular CLI, Adventures in Angular, and you will be able to find it you should be able to find it in the comment section there. But if you don't, it's from the JS verse, so JS from JavaScript. So from the JS verse user on GitHub, there's this library called translocal. And as Alan was saying, this library internally leverages the runtime capabilities of Angular internationalization. So if you're interested in seeing how you can add runtime translations into your Angular application, you can look at how this library is leveraging those functionalities, and maybe even just use that library directly. What would you recommend, Alan? Would you recommend using this library or just looking at how they do it internally?
Uh, I mean, it depends what are your needs. If you need something really sophisticated, that library might do it for you. Uh, However, the standard APIs that Angular provides um, might be enough. I think there might be also some information on how to use the I18N on the issue that I just sent in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I sent this link too. For anyone that can't see the link, so inside the Angular repository on GitHub is the issue number 46,851. So 46851. If you go to this issue on the Angular repository on GitHub, there is a discussion there about how to use runtime translations within Angular.
Yes, and that issue will be uh, updated once we add more documentation, etc. So if you're interested in runtime translation, subscribe to that issue.
Awesome. One other question that came to my mind, kind of a small curiosity, but in recent versions, there was a change from ng dash dash version to ng version without the dash dash, and I'm wondering why did we had this small change. I have a friend that gets it wrong all the time. He's always like, forgot about this.
So the reason being that we changed it was that we changed the entire system that the Angular CLI uses to build the commands and parse command line arguments, etc. So with that change, there were some subtle changes that needed to happen, and one of those was the ng dash version.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So it's just to improve the parsing of another uh, of other functionalities to not make it confusing with other functionalities. Cool. Okay, Alan, thank you so much. I think this was a very interesting episode, and we were able to go into some interesting questions about the Angular CLI. And thank you for your time. I think this was very interesting, very helpful. I know that for me, I was able to make some questions that, at least to me, they were relevant, some things that were in my mind. So thank you very much, Alan. And yeah, do you have anything you'd like to promote? Like this, the floor is yours. Shameless plugs.
No, I just wanted to mention one more thing that in the chat I sent another
Mhm.
I18N library, which is basically done by the community, and it is done by also a former Angular team member, which is ngx translate. Uh, it was a real pleasure having this chat with you. Uh, I hope I answered some questions, and yeah, it was really fun. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Thank you for being on the show. I'm just gonna um, promote. Well, actually, not really gonna promote anything. I think just the companies producing the show. So again, Top End Devs, if you're looking to improve your development skills, so Top End Devs is the company that produces this show and many others. So if you're looking for more technical content, you can look at topenddevs.com. And if your company or someone that you know is looking for remote design or web development services, you can look for Unvoid, is UNVOID. So un and void.com. And they offer remote design and software development services on a performance basis. So their clients only pay after tasks are delivered and approved by the customers. So yes, thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, the audience, for sticking up to the end. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.